ናተይ ድሌት ወትሩ ምስ ሓቀኛታት ተቃለስ ኮንካ ምስራሕ
ብርጌድና ሓመዱ ምንባሩ ኣብዓድ
ዝግብር ሓርነት ወዲ ሰብ ንብሎ ኻልሲ ሓራ ሓመድ
ተሳብና ክንገብራለን
ማዕበል
Dear viewers, it is my distinct privilege to welcome Dr. Michael Rubin to our platform today. Dr. Rubin is a highly respected expert in the field of foreign policy and international relations, serving as the Director of Policy Analysis at the Middle East Forum and a Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. With decades of expertise, he has become a leading voice in analyzing authoritarian regimes, including the PFDJ-led Eritrean regime under dictator Isaias Afwerki. Dr. Rubin has dedicated significant attention to uncovering the pervasive political repression, economic exploitation, and human rights abuse carried out by the Eritrean regime. His scholarly work and meticulously researched articles have brought to light the systemic corruption, transnational repression, and destabilizing role of the regime, not just in Eritrea, but across in the Horn of Africa. Through his in-depth analysis, he has highlighted the regime's effort to silence dissent, manipulate the diaspora, and circumvent the international sanctions, offering actionable recommendations for policymakers to address these challenges effectively. His contribution goes beyond academic and policy circles. They resonate with activists, victims of oppression, and anyone who values justice and accountability. Today, we have a unique opportunity to gain deeper insight from Dr. Rubin on topics ranging from the effectiveness of the US sanctions to strategies for countering transnational repression and advancing human rights in Eritrea. Dr. Rubin, thank you for joining us. Your expertise is invaluable, and we look forward to learning from your perspective. Welcome, sir.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's start with your recent article that you wrote in a website 1945. In your article, you said America must act now, and then continues to say the United States should openly support regime change in Eritrea. Do you mean that the United States should change the regime in Eritrea by any means necessary, including military forces, boots on the ground, or only support and engage with Eritrean opposition forces who seek regime change in Eritrea openly? Can you elaborate, please?
Of course. Let me be clear. The United States has no reason to militarily involve itself in Eritrea. Change is going to come, but it's going to come from the Eritreans themselves. And we already see the Eritreans crystallizing in terms of organization and leadership abroad. And presumably, many Eritreans inside Eritrea are also chafing at what has become an untenable situation. I'm a historian by training, and I don't just focus, of course, on Africa, but there's also, one of the tragedies I see in Eritrea, which has also impacted other regions and countries in the world, is that sometimes the people who make great freedom fighters, the people who lead in civil wars and win independence for their people, they have a certain skill set, which is important when they are fighting a war for independence. But that skill set doesn't necessarily translate into being a good governor, a good president. So we saw this, for example, with Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, whose tenure and whose dictatorship was ruinous to the country of Zimbabwe. We've also seen this in a place where I spend a lot of time, Iraqi Kurdistan, where the so-called Peshmerga, the Kurdish militia, they fought in the mountains against the dictator Saddam Hussein. But once they took power, they were too corrupt. Those who were fighting in the mountains didn't necessarily make good government bureaucrats. A wise leader understands what he's good at and when he needs to let a new generation lead. What we need now in Eritrea is for a new generation to lead, and anyone who's ever met Eritreans knows just how much human capital they have, how much skill. I mean, Eritrea, with proper leadership, could be a Singapore. It could be a bastion of wealth. I mean, we often hear the slogan, African solutions for African problems. It could be a Botswana. It could be a Namibia. It could be a country that has succeeded. And unfortunately, right now, it's another Zimbabwe or Burundi.
Yeah, it is. Unfortunately, the regime and the supporters deliberately, for your article saying that Dr. Rubin is calling for regime change, asking for the American government to intervene, as I said, like militarily, but we all know that that's what not you said. So in their response to your article, the regime's embassy in Washington, D.C., they said that regime change in Eritrea can only push the country into civil war like other countries such as Libya, Syria, and Iraq. And this scare tactic has been used by the regime for many years. So what is your response to that argument from the embassy?
Look, I mean, first of all, when a regime openly lies, when its embassy openly lies, they are either showing that they are illiterate and they simply don't know how to read, or they're lying about what the argument is because they don't have the facts to rebut the argument. There's not much you can really defend about the Isaias Afwerki regime because it has failed so completely. So look, I understand that the government is going to lie because they simply don't have any basis to tell the truth and convince people that they're doing the right thing. But if I may, one other fact that we just need to realize, Isaias Afwerki is getting old. And so we really do need to have a conversation, not Americans, but Eritreans, about what's going to happen next. Because even if Isaias Afwerki acts as the dictator of Eritrea till his dying day, what is going to come afterwards is a very valid question. And Eritreans should be able to debate that openly.
Yeah, as you say, like the regime is in its last leg, the dictator is, he has a stroke recently and he's old and, change is inevitable, in Eritrea. So, but most, when changes happen, like what happened in Syria right now after, many years of dictatorship, the country has a hard time transitioning from a dictator to a democratic nation. So what should Eritreans do to prepare for the change that is inevitable, the change that is coming one way or the other?
Again, let me talk as a historian. Mm-hmm. On the 25th anniversary of the Polish Solidarity movement, the movement that ultimately led to the fall of the Soviet bloc, I met with Lech Walesa, who won the Nobel Peace Prize. And he, after the communists fell in Poland, he became president, and then very quickly he too failed. And eventually he learned his lessons and he came back. But when you talk to the people who were at the helm of the opposition when, for example, communism fell, the East Bloc collapsed, what they will tell you are some very specific lessons they learned about the mistakes they made during the transition. One of the key mistakes is always being reactive, not understanding that when the transition happens, it's going to happen very, very quickly. So the opposition may have fought Bashar al-Assad for 14 years, but it only took a week for really Bashar al-Assad to fall. And then people were caught unprepared. And Syria isn't doing as well as many people now say. The Hayat Tahrir al-Sham only controls 30% of the country. There's other groups. Syria's in for some trouble. But let's talk about what happened in Poland. Are Eritrean Americans or Eritrean Europeans talking to the Poles to figure out how they dealt with some of the major problems that came in transition? Are they talking it to the people from Zimbabwe? Are they talking to the ANC in South Africa about how to hit the ground running? The key issue is you don't simply want to sit around just doing opposition, just saying Isaias Afwerki is bad. Everyone knows that. What you want to do is set the stage for a new curriculum in the high schools and in the universities, a new law for private property and for commerce. Because the other thing you don't want is once Eritrea falls to have a bunch of people from the Gulf, Saudis, Emiratis, come up and buy up the country. How are you going to protect the heritage? How are you going to protect the Eritreans? Those are the plans that need to be made now. It has nothing to do with the United States. It has everything to do with protecting Eritrea so that Eritrea can thrive on its own rather than be preyed upon by outside powers.
All right, Dr. Rubin. Many Eritreans believe that, in your article, you mentioned that the Iraqi Liberation Act, that makes, for the U.S. government to openly engage in regime change with the opposition group. But many Eritreans believe as well, on your article, that the U.S. may not have huge interest in Eritrea to get really involved in regime change strategy. So the U.S. policy so far long have been containment policy towards the regime in Eritrea. They were try to contain Isaias. So as a historian, what makes you think that the new administration will or should change the long existing policy and involve in regime change policy and openly cooperating or working with Blue Revolution or the opposition, Eritrean opposition?
Let me put it in this way. Mm-hmm. Regime change and democracy are two sides of the same coin. We just had regime change in Washington, D.C., when we had a new president come into power. Mm-hmm. If you actually want to go back to the Iraq Liberation Act, mm-hmm. it didn't call for the military overthrow of Saddam Hussein per se. But what it did say is that the United States should interact, American diplomats should interact with different Iraqi groups, because the sovereignty shouldn't simply rest in a dictator like Saddam Hussein. So if we have an Eritrean Liberation Act, for example, what it's going to mean is that American diplomats all over the world will meet with Eritreans, will not pick sides. It's not the job of the Americans to decide which Eritrean group to support, but we can support all Eritreans collectively. The other thing the Iraqi Liberation Act did was to enable broadcasting, more broadcasting into Iraq from Iraqi voices from outside the country, people that weren't under the thumb of Saddam Hussein. So what are we doing to actually support, if people want to be supported, organizations that might want to broadcast shortwave radio, satellite television, internet programs, and so forth? Now, here's the thing, and this is something I learned when I was in government working on Iran. If the United States helps any outside group, a country like Iran is simply going to say, oh, all the opposition, they're just all American, they're funded by the Americans. But here's the thing, they're going to say that anyway. So if you're going to be accused of being a foreign pawn, which is nonsense, why not at least have the ability to broadcast and make your case? The other important thing about the Iraq Liberation Act is it simply raised the level of Iraq so that congressmen heard about it, so that diplomats had to deal with it, so that the U.S. Treasury Department had to think about it. If we have an Eritrean Freedom Act, for example, not liberation, Eritrean Freedom Act, simply having the debate in Congress is going to make people aware that Isaias Afwerki is one of the worst dictators on earth, one of the most corrupt men on earth, who has no reason to live on this earth.
All right, good. By the way, I mean, really that the proposal that you made, the Eritrean Freedom Act instead of Liberation Act, and definitely interaction with the Congress and other government agents would really help. For instance, as Eritrean public media have a satellite service that broadcasts to Eritrea to educate the public and also expose all the lies and everything that the people inside doesn't have access.
Yeah.
So that's where really it would help for us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And look, I mean, sometimes people will say, why is a white guy like Michael Rubin talking about this? Mm-hmm. First of all, I mean, the people who talk about this sometimes just don't know my history. I was actually a Congressional Black Caucus Foundation fellow because of my activism in Black churches growing up in Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. But putting that aside, the fact of the matter is, I can talk openly because Isaias Afwerki can't do a damn thing to silence me. Because I'm not Eritrean, I don't have Eritrean relatives. I have many Eritrean friends, and so when I speak openly, I'm speaking openly because not everyone else can. And so if you want your answer about why I'm talking, it's because I'm not afraid of a dictator like Isaias Afwerki, and he has no ability to target me or my family.
And this is really appreciated by so many Eritreans, including myself, and not only for you, but for so many who openly advocating for the Eritrean people. So that is really appreciated. So to continue to my question, the regime and its supporters argue that the U.S. intervention in many countries, such as Libya, Iraq, and Somalia, led to catastrophic civil war and failed states. And they say that the result shouldn't be any different if it happened in Eritrea as well. From your long history, from your long time expertise, what led to civil war or failed state in above countries? Is the U.S. intervention or the legacy and weak institution left from the deposed dictators? How can we avoid also such failed state or civil war, after the regime in Eritrea?
It's a great question, and it's a fair question. Mm-hmm. I would argue that the Eritreans, for example, who are saying, oh, the United States caused civil war in all these countries, they're actually racist. Because what they are doing is taking away the accountability, the so-called agency, the ability to make decisions and have consequences from the people in these countries. And when we look at the situation in Libya, the Libyan uprising started before the United States got involved. The United States got involved, and we can debate this to try to mitigate some of the problems. The Syrian civil war started before the United States got involved, several years before. In fact, people criticized President Barack Obama for not engaging the opposition sooner. And we also have had, the Americans, when we got involved in Somalia, it was because the dictator Siad Barre had ruined the country and then fled, I believe, to Nigeria. And the Somalis turned upon themselves. So it was actually a United Nations humanitarian operation that led the United States to become involved. And we can also look at other places: Kosovo, Bosnia, and Korea, South Korea, Japan, Germany, of course. The fact of the matter is, the United States has been involved in a number of countries. We can debate whether it's wise or not, but it's not. Your people who say the United States is to blame are confusing cause and effect. If I needed to criticize the United States' actions in Iraq and in Afghanistan, what I would actually say is the biggest mistake the Americans made was flooding these countries with money, because that created dysfunctional corruption. When I look at not a recognized state, but something like Somaliland, the reason why Somaliland is doing relatively well is because they don't receive a lot of international aid. And therefore, if money starts disappearing, everyone's going to know. They basically have to live off the customs revenue from the Wajale customs post with Ethiopia. we can also look at a country like Rwanda. And the United States, of course, people forget that in 1994, at the end of the anti-Tutsi genocide, it was the United States which actually took the airport in Kigali to allow international humanitarian aid to come through. One of the greatest successes of Rwanda, again, African solutions for African problems, is that President Paul Kagame has basically defeated corruption in a way that has given hope to a new generation to build up the tech industry to make Rwanda into a Silicon Valley. There's no reason why those lessons, the lessons of Somaliland, the lessons of Rwanda, can't be embraced by Eritreans. Again, African solutions for African problems. And the Eritreans actually have the benefit of seeing what the best examples are from the 50 plus African countries to imitate those. So you don't have to become South Sudan or Libya. You can become Rwanda or Botswana or Namibia or Somaliland.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. There are a lot of countries that we can take lessons. It's not only always a failure, but that's the scare tactic, trying to scare the Eritrean public, you know. So let's talk about the sanctions and their effectiveness. You know, the U.S. government has implemented several target sanctions on Eritrea, including measures under the Magnitsky Act of 2022, Executive Order of 13818, and the more recent EO 14606. These sanctions aim to pressure region by targeting the People's Front for Democracy and Justice, PFDJ, its military operations, and key financial network, and select individual in its leadership position. So, Dr. Rubin, in your expert opinion, how effective has the sanctions been in creating meaningful pressure on the region? Have they succeeded in achieving their intended objectives, or have there been notable limitations? Do you think they will continue under the new administration, and what can be done to expand them?
Well, okay, this is the problem with sanctions.
Yes.
Eritrea doesn't have much of an economy because of decades of dictatorship by Isaias Afwerki, and therefore sanctions work best and are most effective upon countries that have a lot to lose. But under Isaias Afwerki, he's been the worst sanction that you could have upon any country because of his sheer incompetence. Now, actually, when you, that said, so a lot of the sanctions are symbolic. When it comes to Magnitsky Act sanctions, absolutely, if they're targeting specific individuals, which is what the Magnitsky Act sanctions do, there's no harm. If they target people who will understand that they can't simply take their money and put it in Panama or in the Cayman Islands or in a Swiss bank. That's important. But when we were talking about the anger which the Eritrean regime, which Isaias Afwerki had to my recent article, the reason why I think they got so angry was because I suggested that the United States and the international community sanction one of the banks in Eritrea, which Eritreans are forced to pay their 2% tax into. Frankly, when it comes to the 2% tax, if the United States designates that bank as basically being a terror financier, and it becomes illegal to transfer money into that bank, look, let the Eritreans keep their extra 2%. There's lots of things they can do with it in Europe or the United States. More power to them. And I think that's what really got the Isaias Afwerki regime afraid.
ሳተላይት ቴሌቪዥን ኤርፒኤም ምስ ህዝቢ ይህን ምህን ምባልን ናብ ዝቕጽል መድረኽ ንምስጋርን ናብ 14 ከተማታት ኣሜሪካን ካናዳን ካብ መጋቢት 1 ጀሚራ ዑደት ክትከብር እያ። በዚ መሰረት ደንቨር መጋቢት 1፣ ዳላስ መጋቢት 2፣ ቤይ ኤሪያ መጋቢት 8፣ ሲያትል መጋቢት 9፣ አትላንታ መጋቢት 15፣ ቻርሎት መጋቢት 16፣ ዊኒፔግ መጋቢት 29፣ ሚኒያፖሊስ መጋቢት 30፣ ኤድመንተን ሚያዝያ 5፣ ካልጋሪ ሚያዝያ 6፣ ቶሮንቶ ሚያዝያ 12፣ ኣብ መወዳእታ ድማ ዋሽንግተን ዲሲ ሚያዝያ 13። ኣብዚ ናይ ይህን ምህን ዘተ ናይ ህዝቢ ሕቶታት ክንምልስን ሓሳባት ክንሰምዕን ኢና። ኣብ መወዳእታ ድማ ህዝቢ ብተሳትፍኡ ዋናነቱ ኣብ ትካል ሳተላይት ቴሌቪዥን RPM ከረጋግጽ ክንጽበይና ሳተላይት ቴሌቪዥን RPM.
Okay, in your again, despite the sanctions, as you said, the Eritrean government able to circumvent them by leveraging alternative revenue streams, as you mentioned. This includes the controversial 2% diaspora tax and the use of proxy organizations, often disguised as community associations, to engage in fundraising and, in some cases, extortion. So, Dr. Rubin, with the growing attention on these tactics, what actions do you anticipate from the U.S. government to address and curb this circumvention efforts? Do you force stricter enforcement, new sanctions, or other innovative measures being introduced?
Okay. Well, I do think that Isaias Afwerki has a lot to be very concerned about. Because while one of the problems with the United States across administrations is that, let's face it, the Americans don't pay much attention to Africa. I think we should pay a lot more attention to Africa. The fact of the matter is the team that is coming in now, especially Peter Pham, who will be the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, he knows Eritrea. He knows what Isaias Afwerki has done to the country. He knows how corrupt Isaias Afwerki and his family are. And therefore, I suspect that he is going to do what's necessary in order to pressure Isaias Afwerki, even if it means complaining to some of the Gulf states and others who might want to try to strike deals with Isaias Afwerki. I think that Isaias Afwerki is in real trouble right now.
Okay, so in your article also you mentioned that the U.S. government can seize, the Isaias and then his cronies funds, outside, so that they can be used for rebuilding Eritrea. This has been effective, for the U.S. has been doing this in many countries. But given that the Eritrean regime, as you say, that doesn't have a lot of banking, networking outside, it's not part of the SWIFT. Can this be effective, or do you see any way that the U.S. government can seize any resources or anything from the SAS and his cronies?
Well, yes. The short answer is yes, because Isaias Afwerki, again, he is corrupt. As Eritreans suffer, as they flee through the desert to Libya or to Saudi Arabia up the Red Sea coast, as they put their lives on the line and struggle, Isaias Afwerki is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And the fact of the matter is that money is somewhere. The question is, where exactly is it? Now, oftentimes, many dictators like Isaias Afwerki will buy real estate through shell corporations in a place like London. There's actually a lawsuit right now in the District Court for Washington, D.C., the United States District Court for the District of Columbia, because a document leak showed more than 70 shell corporations that were owned by Masoud Barzani, the president of Iraqi Kurdistan, and his son Masroor. The fact of the matter is, this wealth does eventually leak. And one of the things which the Eritrean opposition needs to do, especially those who have expertise in finance, is set up some sort of charitable fund to receive the money as it's identified, and to have a mechanism and bylaws transparent in place so that the money which is confiscated from Isaias Afwerki's properties can be used to reconstruct Eritrea once he is gone.
All right. So we know that the Eritrean government does a lot of transnational repression and harassment. The Eritrean government has well-documented history of engaging in transnational repression, often targeting members of its diaspora, activists, critics. Even former loyalists have faced harassment, intimidation, and in some cases detention when traveling to neighboring countries or even Eritrea itself. A recent example, like a week ago, involved a US-based Eritrean American. He's a well-known artist, a celebrity. He was a pro-government who narrowly avoided arrest, and his passport was confiscated in Eritrea. He was one of the key supporters of the region, but because of the friction between him and then the Eritrean chargé d'affaires in Washington, D.C., when he traveled to Eritrea, they put some against him, and the regime, the security apparatus, they put him in prison, but he left on foot through the border. So on that regard, what legal mechanisms or protections are available in the United States to safeguard individuals from such harassment and retaliations? Additionally, how do you believe the U.S. government should respond to those tactics to ensure the safety and right of Eritrean diaspora members, Eritrean Americans as well?
The first thing I would suggest to every Eritrean group, a legitimate group, I don't mean government front, is to approach law enforcement, federal law enforcement in their region, whoever the FBI's regional bureau is, wherever it is, in Seattle, in Maryland, in Texas, and so forth, and basically ask for the name of the person who is going to be the liaison from that from the law enforcement community to the Eritreans, so that if there is an issue, that you have a single man, a single woman on speed dial that you can talk with, that gets to know the community and is slowly becomes trusted by the community. If you simply call the police randomly every time the Eritrean regime tries to act, you never know where those reports are going to go. But if you always deal with the same person in your region, they're going to start noticing a pattern. They're going to start noticing that the Eritrean regime has targeted 6, 7, 8, 9, 15 people in their region. And that's what's going to get the action. So this is why the Eritrean diaspora organizations are so important. I know, for example, that working in a think tank, especially dealing with some countries that are state sponsors of terror, dealing with them in terms of criticizing them, that I've been threatened personally, and other people in the think tank community have as well. And every think tank has a designated law enforcement person who they can make reports to when we receive death threats, for example. That's the type of thing that the Eritrean community here needs to start with.
All right. So in the same case, we know that the regime works through different, like non-profit organizations, and then they harass, intimidate, and does so many things. And most of them, they do not register with the Justice Department as representative of the Eritrean government. They don't follow the FARA Act, the Foreign Registration Act as well. So in your view, should these associations be subject to more rigorous scrutiny and oversight by U.S. authorities? What specific action should the U.S. government take to ensure those groups comply with the law and prevent the misuse of the U.S. institution for repression and intimidation? Because a lot of them, they do not have registration with the justice.
No, I get it. Okay, first of all, what you're referring to is the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which says that if you are representing, taking direction from, or taking money from a foreign government or even a foreign company, that you need to register as a foreign agent on their behalf. Just for the sake of transparency, let me say, I take no money from any foreign government, any foreigner, or for that matter, from the U.S. government either. I work at a nonprofit, I have a salary, but I don't take money for what I write. And therefore, when I'm talking about the Foreign Agents Registration Act, what I am aware of is that the Justice Department is starting to crack down much more on this. And so those people who believe that they can bypass U.S. law by setting up a fake nonprofit or fake civil society organization, they're going to be in a world of hurt. They're going to end up in jail. They should be aware of that right now. The second thing, and this is a strategy more broadly for Eritreans who may want to fund it, is there's a U.S. law called, or a group of laws called RICO, which is basically an anti-racketeering law, which was used to bring down the mafia in Chicago, for example, in the 1930s. And what it says is that when there is a criminal conspiracy, that everyone who's a part of that criminal conspiracy is equally guilty. So if a lawsuit is brought against Isaias Afwerki as the head of a conspiracy that involves any of these people who are acting on his behalf, officially or unofficially, in the United States, and let's say there is a damage of $200 million, a judgment against Isaias Afwerki, everyone who works in his various shell organizations in the United States, they're going to lose their house. They're going to lose their savings. Because Isaias Afwerki, if he doesn't pay up, everyone underneath him is going to be presumed equally guilty. And I suspect it's only a matter of time until a RICO suit brings down the Afwerki mafia inside the United States. Get ready.
All right. In one of your articles for the National Interest, you explored the troubling relationship between the Eritrean embassy in Washington and the diplomatic place being a den of organized crime, highlighting how this connection bolsters the regime's global influence. You also emphasized the need for more coherent and robust U.S. strategy toward Eritrea. So, Dr. Rubin, what specific steps do you believe the U.S. should take to hold the Eritrean government accountable, not only for its transnational activities and actions abroad, but also for its ongoing human rights violation within Eritrea itself?
Okay, look, again, I'm a historian by training, and one of the examples we have is with regard to North Korea. Mm-hmm. When it comes to North Korean embassies, they have one job, and that's to raise revenue for North Korea. So some North Korean embassies in the past in Africa have been involved with illegal poaching of animals and shipping, for example, rhinoceros horns to China for cash. The North Korean embassy in Havana likewise engages in smuggling and organized crime. The Eritrean embassies are much the same way. They have one job, and that's to raise money. Another reason, by the way, why I think that Isaias Afwerki was so afraid of my article, he really is a coward, is because I was quoting the Eritrean ambassador to South Sudan, who gave this interview that he probably shouldn't have given. It was very, it showed the criminal nature of the regime. Basically, what we need to do is, with monitoring, we need to shut down these criminal networks. And it's difficult because they're abusing their diplomatic privileges. But again, if you do abuse your diplomatic privileges, there's a limit to the numbers of diplomatic privileges. And so when it comes to those in the United States, including at the United Nations, we need to be expelling people. And if we need to, if they're American citizens and they're violating U.S. law, then they need to be arrested for that. And when we look at the Eritreans in Europe, in Canada, elsewhere, basically what we need to do is have a crackdown on the abuse of the diplomatic conventions.
So, as you mentioned, the ambassador to South Sudan, I have his video clip. Actually, we were able to first get that one when they publish, and we're able to download and disseminate to the public. And let me just put this video. There is transcribed in English, and we will talk about it, okay?
Yeah, sure, great.
መንግስቲ ኤርትራ ኣብ ዲያስፖራ ወይ ድማ ኣብ ደገን ዝቕመጥ ኤርትራዊ ካብቲ ኣብ ውሽጢ ሃገር ዘሎ ፈለየ ከም ዘይሪኦ ብግብሪ ኣረጋጊፅሉ እዩ። ኤርትራ ኣብ 4 ግንባራት ይቆይዋ 3 ግንባራት ኣብ ውሽጢ ሃገር ኣለዋ 4 ግንባር ከዓ ኣብ ደገ ኣሎ ማለት ብመንገዲ መሓውራቱ መንግስቲ ኤርትራ ብመንገዲ ኤምባሲታቱ ከዓ ነዚ 4 ግንባር የመሓድሮ رابع جنبار أجر كم تقولتو برميتان سيتخيز أنا حاسات هجي زقولو إريتراوي أبدا جاز وما أدلو لا شدرو زلو أخو جنزب كنتي نقولتي.
So, according to him, the Eritrean ambassador to South Sudan, he was saying that, there are pro-regime Eritreans in diaspora, often described as the fourth front by the Eritrean regime, a term even acknowledged by him, who admitted that those groups function as extension of the Eritrean embassy structure. And you have previously highlighted this network as a tool to exhort and threaten the diaspora. So in your view, Dr. Rubin, how does this network shape the political discourse surrounding Eritreans within the U.S. and other countries? Additionally, what steps can the U.S. government take to address the influence these groups exert on public opinion and policy, particularly when their actions involve intimidation, coercion, and other tactics to silence the Eritreans in diaspora?
Well, first of all, what the ambassador is admitting, what he is confessing, is that all these organizations in the diaspora, which the Eritreans treat as a fourth front, are violating the U.S. Foreign Agents Registration Act. Period. You show his statements in court, you lose. And so this is an important admission on the part of the Eritrean government to start to unwind the deniability, the plausible deniability which it has had. But when it comes to changing public opinion, like I said in a previous interview, you can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig. The fact of the matter is, no matter how much Isaias Afwerki can pay trolls, or perhaps even pay a lobbyist, he's not going to change the reputation of Eritrea because the facts are there for all to see. If Kim Jong-un in North Korea decided to pay someone a lot of money to describe North Korea, that it was the best thing akin to a beach resort in the Caribbean, no amount of money would make anyone believe that was true. And so this is the problem with Eritrea. Isaias Afwerki does not have truth on his side, and everyone increasingly knows it. The question then becomes, given his failure, given the fact that he won't even subject himself to a referendum, an internationally supervised referendum, ultimately he's giving the people one choice, which is changing the regime on their own. The United States can cheer them on, so can everyone else. But no one is going to be involved in changing the regime other than the Eritreans themselves. And when it comes to transnational repression, this is a tactic of a man who is desperately afraid, who realizes he must reach out hundreds, thousands of kilometers away because his society is so weak and the image which he's crafted for himself is so artificial. So it's going to be risky. And you need to have law enforcement on your side to protect you from the transnational repression. But also recognize transnational repression for what it is. It's a sign of desperation on the part of Isaias Afwerki. It's sort of like when I look at what Eritrean trolls say on Twitter or whatever, or Facebook about my articles. If my articles didn't hit home, they would have no reason even to write. The fact that the consulate or the embassy here issued that statement, it just shows how cowardly Isaias Afwerki is. He's a dead man walking.
Yeah, indeed, absolutely. In the speech that I showed you in that interview, he also said that the government or Eritrea is running from the remittance, from the diaspora remittance.
Exactly.
And we know that all this money is going through illegally or through money laundering. There is no Western Union or other ways of transfer. We call them the money transfer called Eritrea's Hawala, which is money laundering. So how can the government, the U.S. government, stop or make sure that this money laundering scheme stops, so that the government or people working for him get accountable, because that's where most of his revenue is getting.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I would push back a little bit. Mm-hmm. I don't look at Hawala simply as money laundering. It's a different system. Mm-hmm. But for example, many Eritreans may be familiar with the Habshir, which is a Hawala system that after or M-Pesa separately in Kenya, after September 11th, after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, the U.S. Treasury Department develop protocols for helping to regulate some of this. And so when we look at a company like the Hubshare today, the United States generally has no problem with it. There is a mechanism for accountability. The issue is, how can we impose the same mechanism of accountability on Eritrea, on the Isaias Afwerki regime, on his political party, and so forth? And that's why in my article I named a specific bank in order to, that's what we need to look at. So I wouldn't say it's the entire system, the Hawala system, that's the problem. But you're right, it's the dishonesty and the money laundering in certain capacities. But this is another issue. When Isaias Afwerki goes, Eritrea can join the modern banking system. And so given the human capital which Eritreans represent in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, do we have Eritrean bankers working for major international banks that can come together and draft a banking law for Eritrea so that the system can be normalized and Eritrea can join the world stage, the world financial system, as smoothly as possible?
Yeah, I mean, not the entire Hawala system is money laundering, but the one that is practiced in Eritrea. Because, the Hubshare is, they are regulated, they are, following the U.S. government regulations. But here...
They're regulated since 9/11. Before that, not so much.
Yeah, but in Eritrean case, there are individuals like all over the states.
Yeah.
They take money from you and then they send it to Eritrea. So it's just like you give them money here and they exchange it. The government, the U.S. government doesn't know that about that transaction is happening between Eritreans and then the middlemen and also inside Eritrea.
But this is what I said in my article. If you designate the recipient banks in this case, or the recipient offices as being involved with a foreign terrorist organization, then anyone who is facilitating that transaction or participating in it would face legal jeopardy. And so that's ultimately what we need to do. And if you're telling an Eritrean American, look, most Eritrean Americans are law-abiding citizens in the United States. Let me put it this way. Eritrean Americans, Eritrean immigrants to the United States contribute more to the United States than so many other immigrant groups. It's hugely important to us. But the fact of the matter is, they're not going to want to take this risk. And if we give them the ability to tell the Eritrean government, no, because you can't ask me to go to jail for your 2% bribe, then what I see us doing is actually supporting the Eritrean community itself.
All right, Dr. Rubin, in 2023, in Washington Examiner article, you criticized Secretary Antony Blinken's decision to scale back sanctions on Eritrea, highlighting the importance of the Magnitsky Act of 2022, advocating for disciplined confrontation as a strategy. However, it appears that this approach, disciplined confrontation, was later removed from the U.S. integrated country strategy on Eritrea. So, Dr. Rubin, why do you believe that approach of disciplined confrontation is critical and should be reinstated as part of the U.S. policy toward Eritrean regime? Additionally, how would you evaluate the current State Department's handling of the sanction enforcement? Do you anticipate any shift in their strategy moving forward?
Well, let me put it this way. With Peter Pham coming in as Assistant Secretary of State, I believe we're going to go back to the status quo ante. I believe that we're going to see ramped up pressure. And I should say that, I mean, when I'm sitting here in the Washington, D.C. area, people in the U.S. government who don't necessarily agree with what the State Department is doing are the ones who are sometimes giving me a hint that certain policies are underway. And that was certainly the case in this situation, that Tony Blinken's policy was very unpopular among many of the people who ordinarily work on Eritrea. They understand that Isaias Afwerki can't be reformed. He's done too much. I mean, if you think about a serial killer who's killed 30 people, you can't suddenly make him into a Mother Teresa. And Tony Blinken may have been naive, but Tony Blinken's the exception. I think we're about to see the rule again.
That's what we are hoping. I mean, especially with the incoming new administration and people like Peter Pham and also Tibor Nagy. So we hope that this the pressure will ramp up. I mean, you've been very vocal against the regime and also supporting the Eritrean activists. As a historian, what advice would you give to the Eritrean opposition in diaspora to enhance their influence and effectiveness in engaging with the U.S. policymakers?
Okay, that's a great question. First of all, I know that many Eritreans like to write for other Eritreans. Let me say, as a non-Eritrean, that's a waste of time. What you need to do is write for your local newspapers that are read by non-Eritreans. You need to write for the Washington newspapers like The Hill, which is read by Congress. The advice I always give to people that are trying to write is you look at the paper you're trying to write for. If it's the New York Times, if it's the Washington Post, if it's The Hill, whatever it is, Los Angeles Times, you look at their word count. If they only publish op-eds that are 600 words long, don't give them 5,000 words. Don't even give them 700 words. Give them 600 words. You have to follow their direction. And ultimately, what we see when someone like me writes and gets such a response from the Eritrean regime, it shows you that this is their Achilles heel. This is their weak part. They don't want their dirty laundry exposed in the American press, the European press, and so forth. My other advice is when talking to Congress, you should have one point and one point only so that the congressman understands you instead of coming in with a list of 10 or 20 different things. I would also say that if you're going to go into Congress, you don't just say human rights is bad. You have to ask for something. And the reason I say that is if you're going to ask for something, it means that the congressman is going to tell the staffer, you have 2 weeks to answer this. And if the staffer's working on it, then the meeting doesn't go away. But otherwise, the congressman might have 10 meetings a day. Within a week, 70 meetings, your meeting is going to get forgotten. So you always have to ask. And the last point I would make, as regime change nears in Eritrea, there are various different opposition groups. And I take no favorites between them. But when I started in Washington in 1999, there was a young man named Barham Saleh, who was the head of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, which was one of the major Iraqi Kurdish parties. There was another Iraqi Kurdish party called the Kurdistan Democratic Party, and they had just fought a civil war. Barham Saleh had a rule. In Washington, D.C., he was not going to talk about inter-Kurdish politics. He wasn't going to go into Congress and complain about other Kurds. The only thing, even if they were his political rivals, the only thing he was going to do was talk about justice for Kurdistan. Because the second you start criticizing others, you get ignored by everyone. So what's got to be understood is Eritrean politics are only for Eritreans. When you're dealing with the Americans, the nationalism has to come through. No one wants to hear you badmouth anyone else. You simply talk about the best way forward for Eritrea without talking negatively about any other Eritrean opposition group. And then it will be amazing. Now, circling back to my story, Barham Saleh rose because of the respect he received to become president of the Republic of Iraq. One of you may very well, one of your listeners may very well become president of Eritrea.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, trying to have a united front when present, in your case, the Congress or any other, is very important. And that's, a lot of Eritreans say that we need to have this united front. We may have differences in opinion, we may have difference in so many things, but we must have a common enemy. That's the regime. So
exactly.
Yeah, so that's where we should focus. So how does so many people ask? I know that so many people reach out to you, and then also from different angles, they do also reach out to Congress from different angles. That a lot of people didn't like it, including me, because we just have to, make sure that we have a united force, as we have been saying. But, how does the U.S. engage with Eritrean opposition groups or activists in the diaspora? Are there any formal or informal channels for dialogue? And what challenges that the U.S. face when working with Eritrean opposition groups in diaspora? You're not working for the government, obviously, but, what do you see, from just your expertise? Yeah.
No, and I want to make clear, I don't work for the government.
Yeah.
But what I would say is the State Department tends not to pay enough attention to Africa across the entire continent. But there are people who focus on Eritrea, and their job is to get to know you. And so it may take a few phone calls to get to the Eritrean desk officer, but ask. But don't just focus on the State Department. What I always tell people is the State Department's job is to carry out policy. The Congress's job is to make policy. And so if you can get a law passed through Congress, bipartisan, because it should be both a Democratic and a Republican interest to see freedom in Eritrea, then ultimately you get Congress to tell the State Department what their policy must be. So my advice to people is to work with Congress, to cultivate Congressmen people, to cultivate senators, to get them issuing statements on Eritrea. And then ultimately, you, when change comes to Eritrea, you have your list of allies and their phone numbers. If change comes to Eritrea, and that's when you start making phone calls, no one's going to know you. What you want to be in a position when change happens, that everyone in a congressional staff is going to know who you are. And remember, over the last several administrations, the people, some congressmen and many staffers, are those that ended up in the National Security Council, or in the case of Marco Rubio, as Secretary of State. And therefore, don't simply go for the person at the top. Start cultivating people now. Play the long game.
So let's come to the Horn of Africa. I mean, it's a very volatile region. There is war everywhere, like in Sudan, civil war, Ethiopia, there is internal issue going on, Somalia, and the issue between Somalia and Ethiopia. And then if you just see the link between all these issues, it lays down with Eritrea, or with the regime in Eritrea. And then it just goes to Sudan, creates a lot of issue in Ethiopia, Somalia, and everywhere. But they try to sell also Eritrea as a stable country, even though we all know that that's open prison for its citizens, and also creating all this issue for its neighbors. So how should the incoming administration deal with Eritrea so that to solve the Horn of Africa issue? Literally, I believe that if Isaias is gone, the Horn of Africa would be in a much better place and in a peaceful situation.
Oh, look, I agree. I mean, I go back to, for example, when Farmajo was the president of Somalia, he was taking people unwillingly, against their will, to Eritrea, and the Eritreans were forcing them to fight in Tigray. The fact of the matter is, there's no reason why Isaias Afwerki shouldn't be charged with human trafficking. And you're absolutely right. Look, Djibouti is Djibouti, and it's fairly stable, but it's fairly stable by being neutral. It's fairly stable, even though it's generally a family-run place, by opening itself up to the world, whereas Eritrea is the opposite, and you're absolutely right. And this is what people are starting to wake up to, way too long, I admit, that Eritrea has been actively involved in the civil war, making the civil war in Ethiopia worse. It's involved in the Sudanese war. It's been involved in Somalia. The fact of the matter is, it is an engine for instability throughout the region. And the quicker Isaias is gone, the better the region is going to be. This tragedy that has beset the region over the last 30 years has to come to an end.
Lastly, Dr. Rubin, your work has been a beacon of hope for justice seekers and vast majority of Eritreans yearning for change. Your fearless analysis and dedication to exposing the truth about the Eritrean regime have earned you immense respect and gratitude. While the Eritrean government has been vocally critical of you, calling you a warmonger and dismissing your insight as reckless or even mind-bogglingly stupid, your work resonates deeply with those striving for justice and democracy. We know that the challenges and personal attacks you face are not easy, yet your commitment remains unwavering. For this, Eritreans around the world are deeply thankful and inspired. And we look forward to celebrating your efforts even more when the dictators fall and justice prevails. So finally,
next year in Asmara.
Absolutely. So my question is, how do you manage the intense pressure that comes with such criticism from state officials, and what keeps you motivated to continue covering those critical issues, knowing that your work has such a profound impact?
Well, thank you very much. I would hope that's the case. Look, I have a thick skin, and that's something that also bothers people like Isaias Afwerki. He can toss lies at me, but instead of taking them personally, I look at them as a metric of success. If they're not paying if they're paying attention, and if they're reacting so strongly, it means that they are afraid. I've seen it in other countries, and I've also been around long enough to understand when I would face this by Saddam Hussein's people, for example, or by Omar al-Bashir's people, the fact of the matter is I'm still here. Saddam Hussein is dead and Omar al-Bashir is gone. The fact of the matter is Isaias isn't going to be much past them. And that's the trajectory is down. Look, the way I also look at it is every Democrat wakes up every day and knows when his time in power ends. Every dictator wakes up thinking that today could be his last day. And with Isaias Afwerki, it could be.
Yeah, his last day is coming. We are hoping that this year is going to be his last day. And I thank you very much. Yeah.
But don't thank me, because it's the Eritreans again who are doing it. When I'm speaking out loud, it's because Eritreans are talking to me because they know, again, as an outsider, that they can't pressure me the way they can pressure some of you. So make no mistake, I'm not just speaking on my behalf. I'm speaking for a lot of those whose voices are being suppressed by Isaias Afwerki, Eritreans first and foremost, and they're the ones that need to be thanked. People like you as well.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's really appreciated because friends like you, they will always be remembered. We know that change is coming, sooner or later, and the government and the regime is dying. It's old regime, it's just, so, and hopefully next year we may celebrate in Asmara or end of this year, no matter what. But thank you for everything you do. And I'm just thanking you on my behalf, on every Eritrean's behalf. And I'm sure that the people inside would be very, very grateful, because this is going to be aired via the satellite television. And I'm sure that they are very thankful for people like you, like Stephen Walker, and so many other Americans and others who are advocating for justice in Eritrea. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
ናተይ ድሌት ወትሩ ምስ ሓቀኛታት ተቃለስ ኮንካ ምስራሕ
ብርጌድና ሓመዱ ምንባሩ ኣብ ዓዲ
እጅግር ሓርነት ወዲ ሰብ ንብሎ ካልሲ ሓራ